Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, a repeat guest. Last time he was on the show, probably over 3 years ago, when we were talking about his then exploding best-selling book, which is still exploding and best-selling. It is Michael Watkins, professor of leadership and organizational change at the IMD Business School. As I mentioned, he's the best-selling author of a couple books. You might know him from his book, The First 90 Days, which has over 10,000 reviews on Amazon. I wish my book had 10,000 reviews on Amazon. And he also has a brand new book out called The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, Leading Your Organization into the Future. And if that wasn't enough, he was also recently inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. So today, just to give you guys a little bit of a rundown around what we're going to be talking about, it's really going to be focused on these 6 disciplines of strategic thinking. So we're going to go through what those 6 disciplines actually are from Michael's new book. And then towards the very end in the Leader's Toolkit section, we're going to talk about specifically how to develop your strategic thinking ability. So with that introduction and summary, Michael, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Jacob. Thank you.
You know, you didn't even need to write a new book because your other book is still doing so well. You probably could have just stayed with that theme and topic for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and been good. But somehow you found the time to write a new book. Why this one, and what kind of led to the creation of it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, really delighted to be back with you. The First 90 Days was written, more than 20 years ago. So you've still got lots of time to accumulate those reviews, right? Before you should worry about it.
And it's updated a few times, I believe, right?
So updated once in 2012, 13, and I'm updating it again now because, of course, so much has changed, right? In the world of work and how leaders, function and take charge in leadership roles. And we can talk about that a bit if you want later. So the origins of this really lie in my own sort of personal consulting and coaching practice, right? So, I work primarily with leaders taking new roles. I love working with leaders taking new roles. It's endlessly fascinating to do that because there's always something new and different going on. I always learn something, right? And it's one way I stay in touch with what's happening and continue to write about things that I sort of see emerging or notice that I haven't noticed before. But one of these things was strategic thinking. And, you work with different leaders and they're all good leaders, right? They've gone to senior roles, they've been successful. But you see that, there's really a substantial difference in their ability to think strategically, right? Some are really profoundly good operators and they're okay when it comes to strategic thinking. Others, they're just, crazy good, like so gifted, in their ability to foresee, sense, respond, that it just kind of is fascinating. And that, of course, leads to questions like, is that just part of your brain and the way your genetics and your upbringing, or is there something we can do about it? The other thing is just the turbulence of the times and how critically important it is to be able to engage in strategic thinking. And I noticed that you actually went through what looked like a really interesting program on foresight a few years back, right? So as at thinking in terms of the future. And I actually noticed there's quite a few elements that are similar, right?
Yeah.
But that ability to think about what's coming and focus on what's important and chart a pathway into the future, I'm not sure we've ever seen a time, certainly in my lifetime, when that's been more important than it is right now, right? Just given the enormous turbulence that we're seeing out there. So it was a combination of those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was at the University of Houston. It's funny because a lot of people put the word futurist in their LinkedIn titles and in their job descriptions, but few people realize that it's actually a discipline that you can get a degree in and a master's degree in. I didn't go as far as getting a master's degree, but I got my professional certification in foresight. And yeah, it's a very specific way of thinking. And I remember when I took that certification, I was familiar with some of the concepts, but as they kind of teach you, for example, something like the cone of possibilities or kind of these causal ways to think about stuff and how to break things down in various frameworks, you think about that and you're like, wow, like I never thought about it like this. And it's just a new way of thinking about the future and solving problems and identifying opportunities, which I think is super helpful. It's very, to me, analogous to chess. And people who listen to this
Yes.
program know that I use chess a lot because I play competitive chess. I spend a lot of time with chess. And I think the best way that I could explain, and you correct me if I'm wrong, what strategic thinking is if you ever see an amateur player play chess, they usually think in terms of just one move, right? I'm going to move my pawn, my opponent might move their bishop, and that's kind of like, and then I'll figure it out from there. And strategic thinking, the best way that I can think about it is thinking in terms of various scenarios and possibilities. Not predicting the future, but trying to make sure you're not surprised by what your opponent might do. This is why so many competitive chess games can last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, is because a lot of your time is thinking about all these variations and how you might respond and what your opponent might do. Would you say that's a pretty fair analogy in terms of strategic thinking and being good at chess?
So I think it's a pretty excellent representation of some elements of strategic thinking. Um, and I think that notion of the mental agility, the kind of chess master's skill to sort of foresee action, reaction, move, counter move, is absolutely a hallmark of great strategic thinkers, right? That ability to look at a few plies, a few moves, or whatever it is, and kind of imagine where you're going to go. I'd probably connect it to a bit to visioning, right? I mean, I know
Yeah.
visioning was one of the disciplines you looked at when you were doing the work on futurism, but imagining how the game will evolve and imagining an end state of an attack, right? And how you're going to kind of launch that attack and what's going to happen, and then working backwards from that to what are the moves, the next 3, 4 moves I need to make to kind of set that up,
Yeah,
right? So I think that's
exactly.
very analogous to strategic thinking.
So
I
how,
think there's also an element of chess that is really, really deeply central to strategic thinking, though, that we haven't talked about yet, which is pattern recognition,
yeah,
right? The ability, you're a, you know, you, you play competitively, you play seriously, through that time of becoming the player you are, you played a lot of games, you saw a lot of patterns, and eventually, I suspect, like many, strong chess players, you can look at a board and you sort of see patterns, right? And you see possibility
yeah,
that a novice, is just seeing pieces on the board. They're not understanding the relationship. They're not seeing the possibility.
yep,
And so I think when you look at, and by the way, we just hit 3 elements of my thinking about strategic thinking, right? One is pattern recognition. The second is that mental agility, that chess master skill, and the third is visioning, right? And working forward, looking forward, reasoning backward to what you do. I think there's a few other elements that I include in strategic thinking that I think chess is not as great a model for. Although I'd have to think about it, right? So systems analysis, right? Thinking of things in terms of systems. You sort of mentioned it a bit earlier when we were chatting before the program
yeah,
about causality and causal links and action and reaction and feedback loops and building those mental models of the way complex domains seem to work, right? And knowing that if this happens over here, then that's probably going to have something over there, and that's going to set up a feedback loop down there, and someone's going to buy a hot dog in Poughkeepsie, New York, right? There's a there's a systems view of things, and I was trained originally as an electrical engineer, so that kind of systems thinking was kind of beaten into me through my undergrad. Actually, my PhD was in decision theory, game theory, negotiation, right? So that's some of that
oh,
game thinking is kind of pretty natural, and I think
yeah,
shows up in
yeah,
the
yeah.
book.
Did you know that 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed? That's pretty crazy, right? Make sure that you hit subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get notified when more videos just like this one are released. I think there's, so kind of, and you tell me if I'm correct in this, but as far as chess goes, I know there are certainly a lot of games, for example, where oftentimes, there's kind of the opening phase and the middle phase and the end game phase. And oftentimes in the
Yep.
opening, a lot of the chess players are, as they say, going by the book, meaning the first few moves have been analyzed to death by a computer. And so if you ever watch a chess game, you'll notice that grandmasters in the first oftentimes 10 moves are just playing instantly. And then they get to, maybe move 15 or 16 where everyone kind of stops and now they're thinking on their own. But I know there have been lots of situations, and I watch a lot of chess games, which I know is probably boring for a lot of people. But I've watched a lot of chess games where oftentimes a chess player will make a move on the board and everybody gets very confused by it and nobody understands why that move was made. And it's only maybe 10 moves later or 15 moves later that that move makes sense. And to me, that's, I guess, the best analogy I can think of for this idea of systems thinking is something that you do early on might have an impact much later down the course of the game, maybe an hour later or 2 hours later, where it's like, oh, if I didn't move that pawn, I wouldn't have been able to do this. So being able to
Yeah.
not predict and foresee, but to understand the position and to understand what's going on the board to give yourself that opportunity later on down the road if you need it. So I don't know if that
No, I
is
think that's super
exactly
interesting,
analogous,
right?
but
No, I mean, and what you're also getting into is optionality and creating options for yourself and
yeah,
maintaining strategic flexibility versus committing. There's a really interesting, I think, dimension to what you're saying too about, the value of having a solid strategic playbook versus the ability to improvise, right?
yeah,
I mean, exactly what you said is true, right? There are, many, many openings in chess and they have been analyzed to death. And, you start as a beginner learning the Queen's Gambit declined. I'm making this up, right? Um, and you start
you're
to
the
work
first
through the moves
person
again.
ever on this show, by the way, to mention a chess opening. So you've already skyrocketed in like cool, awesome points in my book.
Well, I play chess online with my sons, right? And I started doing it quite later in life, and I wouldn't ever claim to be particularly gifted. But I think it's great training for the mind,
Yeah,
right? I think it's wonderful training for the mind. And it's one thing I recommend in the book, actually, that people do if they want to get better at that dimension of strategic thinking, right? Which is that ability to think forward a few moves and reason backward, right? But I think, there's many things about which I think are fascinating, right? But, those book moves, there's kind of an analogy to the sort of strategy playbook that companies have, which is kind of a standard set of actions and reactions and responses and so on. But then what happens when a new competitor innovates in some sense and kind of the book gets a little thrown out of the window, right?
yep,
And it could be a move that on the surface looks like stupid, right? But it disrupts, the flow of things in a way that throws the other player off balance. And they may pull it off, right? That moving that pawn when it looks like it's, tantamount to suicide could end up paying off for you, right? Or not, right? And that's
yeah,
pretty interesting, right?
yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we go through these 6 disciplines, how would you explain what strategic thinking is? Because earlier on, you alluded to something which I thought was interesting is that a lot of leaders get to leadership roles, maybe even to CEO positions, because they're good operators, but they're not necessarily good strategic thinkers. So, what is the difference between just being a good, I don't know, a good business thinker, a good operator? Because even to be a good operator, you still need to be able to, think concretely. You still need to be able to be perhaps creative in terms of problem solving. You need to be innovative maybe in some areas, but somehow you could still
Yep.
lack the strategic thinking piece. So, what is
Yep.
strategic thinking? And how do a lot of these leaders and executives get into their roles without even having it?
Yeah. So I guess first thing I want to say is I'm not at all coming down on people who are tremendously gifted operationally, right? I mean, execution, let's face it, is hard.
Yes.
And executing consistently is hard. So let's not kind of say, oh, geez, they're just plain old operators, right? That's not the case. What's really rare in my experience is folks that are both really good on the execution side and really strong on the strategic side.
Hmm.
And they're kind of the unicorns, right? Of which I know a few that have that capability to move between the levels of analysis, between the high level. I one CEO I work with, I mentioned in the book, he described himself after we had a conversation about this, and he wasn't bragging, as a cloud to ground thinker, right? The
Mm.
ability to kind of move up to that high level, drop down to that low operational level, be intentional about what your altitude is, right?
Yeah.
Not fly at the wrong altitude. That's sort of, to me, the essence of it. I mean, I also know people, really great people who are tremendously good visionaries, creative, but you need to pair them with somebody who's really strong in execution. You need to give them a really good EA. You need to provide a chief of staff that's going to make sure everything works. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yep.
I mean, some great companies are run by complementary people who have, the skills on the more visionary side and the skills more on the execution side, and that's okay. But really back to your question, right? So, once I got interested in this, starting to do interviews, starting to talk to people, example would be, leadership development experts, right? People in large companies that are developing next generations of leaders. Okay, what's strategic thinking? I know it when I see it. And so that got me pretty interested, right? Because I wasn't getting very coherent responses to the question. It's not the case, by the way, that people haven't talked about strategic thinking in the past. Of course, people have, but there's a lot less that's been written about it than there has about strategy, right? There is, it's like, if the pile is this high for books on strategy, then the pile is this high for books on strategic thinking.
Yep.
They're not the same thing at all, right? The output of strategic thinking may be a strategy, but a strategic framework, whether it's, Blue Ocean, or Porter's Five Forces, that's not strategic thinking. That's analysis, right?
Yeah.
And that's a different order of things. So the way I started to anchor it. Sorry, go ahead, Drew.
So there, just hearing you talk reminds me of who was it? I think it was Tim Brown. I had him on the show many years ago. He used to be the CEO of IDEO, and he told me about this. I guess you could call it just a short film that's on YouTube. Anybody could find it if you Google The Powers of 10. And he gave me that exact analogy. I don't think he used the word strategic thinking, but he used this idea of being able to zoom in and zoom out. And the whole concept of this very short film is, and I think it was created in the 70s or the 80s, but it basically shows, for example, a couple sitting on a picnic on a grassy field, and then it zooms out. And all of a sudden you see them on the picnic and they're in the park. Then it zooms out again and you see the city. Then it zooms out again and you see the world. Then it zooms out 10 times. And then same thing, it zooms in 10 times up until the point where it goes into like the atoms and molecules that are inside your hand and inside your body. And Tim was telling me that's
fabulous.
He told me that's a very crucial skill for leaders, is you have to be able to zoom out to see really the big picture, but you also have to be able to zoom in to understand how things are working. And so hearing you talk about the ground to cloud or cloud to ground really made me think of that idea of the powers of 10. And again, anybody can find this on YouTube. It's just kind of a cool video.
I will find it because it sounds fascinating, right? But it's exactly the concept, right? And it's the aperture, it's the magnification level. I'd also say though that what's critical is your ability to be intentional about, are you looking at a power of 1, or you're looking at a power of 5, or you're looking at a power of 10? Because you can see people get caught in the weeds with things and not able to pop themselves up and see the big picture. You see people who are up in the big picture and they really can't get down into the detail. So there's something about your ability to shift between those levels in almost exactly the way you're describing, right?
Yeah.
By the way, IDEO, amazing company, extraordinary contributions, I think, in areas like, creativity, design thinking. I mean, they're
one
pretty wonderful
CEO, and I'm curious to hear who you think would be good leaders that are good strategic thinkers. One would be, at least for me, not recently, but the first time he was the CEO of the company, would be a Bob Iger. But a Bob Iger, 1.0. I think after he took over Disney now, there have been a lot of challenges and problems with the company. But I've been reading his book, The Right of a Lifetime. And it's just fascinating how he was able to make deals with people like Steve Jobs, how he was also able to get onto the ground level and go into the parks and get into the nitty-gritty of the decision making. And he was constantly able to both zoom in and zoom out. So to me, he seems like a good person as far as strategic thinking, and really transformed Disney. And again, obviously now I don't think he's doing a very good job, but the first iteration of Bob Iger I thought was spot on with some of the stuff that you're talking about. Any CEOs out there, either past or present, who you think are good exemplars of what it means to be a strategic thinker?
So, his star has dimmed a little in the time since he was at GE, but Jack Welch was renowned for
Oh,
being
I love that you
super good
mentioned
at
Jack
this,
Welch.
right? Yeah, so he was renowned to being super good at this, right? And he almost
Yeah.
had a kind of, again, a playbook, right? They'd go around and do these business unit operational reviews, and he'd come in and the team would present to him, and he'd pick something and just dig, 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 down, 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 and testing to whether the team really understood, right, at a
Yeah.
deep level what was going on. And then once he was sort of convinced that they were, he'd pop back up. They'd have a high level strategic conversation.
Yeah.
So that example always kind of inspired me in thinking about this.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I
so that
like
would be
that you
one.
mentioned Jack Welch for a few reasons. Because one, so I had a few people on the show, well, one in particular, David Gellis, who wrote a book called The Man Who Broke Capitalism, How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America and How to Undo His Legacy. And then you
Ouch.
have, yeah, yes, very brutal, scathing title of. And then you see people like Simon Sinek, who've been very public in calling Jack Welch a bastard. And I always
Hmm.
find this interesting because now I'm not saying Jack Welch is the perfect CEO by any means, but a lot of people, when I ask them, if you could explain and define to me what it means to be a great leader, how would you explain it? And a lot of times they say it's a leader who helps create other leaders. And under
Hmm.
Jack Welch, I think he created something like 32 or 35 other CEOs who worked for Jack Welch, then went on to become CEOs of other companies.
Yep.
And Jack Welch gets a very bad rap. I mean, of course, he earned the nickname Neutron Jack, right? He was famous for the
When he was
ranking.
saving GE, let's be frank, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah. But he also created a lot of these concepts which became very controversial, like mass layoffs, like rank and yank, doing all sorts of things
I
in
know.
GE which people frowned upon. But at the same time, a lot of people I know who worked for Jack Welch, who've been on this show, have said that they've learned tremendous lessons from him. I had, for example, John Chambers, who didn't work directly for
Sure.
Jack Welch, but Jack Welch said he mentored him. I had Frank Blake, the former CEO of the Home Depot, and several other CEOs who said that Jack Welch was a very tough boss, but he was necessary in shaping who these people then became. So it's interesting that you mentioned Jack Welch, right? Because some
Oh, that's
people,
interesting.
yeah, some people hate him and some people love him. So I'm curious to
Yeah.
get your perspective on Jack Welch, and then we can dive into what these six
Yeah,
disciplines
yeah,
are,
for
because he's a
sure.
very
No,
controversial
I,
CEO.
I don't think Jack Welch would care, honestly, what people thought, right? I
Yeah.
think he was pretty consistently doing what he felt he needed to do to make GE successful, first to survive during the turnaround phase, 84, right? And yeah, he took some very hard decisions in 84, but the company wouldn't have survived if he hadn't done that, right?
No.
And it was the number one and two in the industry. It was divestiture, it was closing and slashing and burning. And yeah, Neutron Jack was there. But once that was done, he was a builder in every sense of the word, right? I used to teach a case, Jacob. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned this, called the GE talent machine.
Hmm.
So when I was doing stuff about leadership development, I would teach a case about GE's talent development system and how they assess people and how they move them through the businesses and develop them until they had this incredibly strong bench of leaders, right? And many leaders, and not just at the level you're talking about, have left GE and been very successful in other places, right? It was very much a source of talent for many organizations. That said, GE had a very particular culture. It was a very plain spoken, very hard edged culture that I think reflected Walsh in many ways, right? And so when leaders left GE to go someplace else, they often struggled in the first organization they went to, right? Because my joke was basically that they needed someone to kind of sand the corners off them a little bit, so they would kind of play a little nicer than they did. But that's a pretty powerful legacy to have, right? And
Yeah.
I think and also I think there is probably some envy too of what he accomplished, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So I mean that's just I guess a couple of things about it, right?
Do you think that those types of leaders need the edges sanded? And so the reason why I ask is because
Mm.
today, at least my impression is that we are struggling to find strong, capable leaders. And what I mean by that is, I mean leaders who are willing to take a stance, leaders who are willing to be tough, leaders who are willing to push their people, leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo, leaders who are not constantly just worried about how are you feeling? Is everything okay? And I'm not saying that some of that isn't necessary to have, but if you look at, for example, how GE was created, how Sam Walton created Walmart. I mean, you look at any, for example, company that a founder
Steve
was,
Jobs and Apple.
yeah, exactly. I mean, they worked hard, they pushed people, they didn't take, BS from anybody. Like they worked hard and they didn't have time for a lot of this stuff. It just wasn't, and you wanted to work for that kind of a leader, right? I mean, Elon Musk, for example, gets a bad rap, but I know tons of people who would love to work for an Elon Musk.
Sam Altman.
There's no miscommunication. If you work for an Elon Musk, you will work hard. You will learn a lot. You'll get paid well, but you will work increasingly hard. And to me, it just seems like in today's business world, we've lost some sense of that work ethic of being okay with working hard, being okay with pushing yourself, being okay with doing what is necessary, wanting to make those sacrifices if needed. I mean, today you can't even get employees to show up into the office, which is just mind-boggling to me. What do you think about?
Do you think that's generational? Do you think that's generational, Jacob?
I
Right.
think it's probably a mix of things. So on a generational side, I can tell you one of the things that really freaks me out is there are a lot of these social media trends, specifically on TikTok, with things like the Sunday scaries. I don't know if you've heard of that, but this whole concept of the Sunday scaries is that you're so scared to show up to work on Monday that on Sunday you get like anxiety. Sunday scaries, right? It's
Oh,
like we're watching a cartoon.
interesting.
We have
Yep.
something called lazy girl jobs, which has been trending on social media. And there's literally people who go on social media who tell you how to find a job where you can do as least amount of work as possible while still getting paid. And they tell you what are the questions that you should be asking during the job interview so that you can make sure you don't have to work hard. There's trends on social
That's
media,
fascinating.
and I don't know what the term is, but it's something like you're supposed to ease into the work week, where Monday and Tuesday you kind of take it easy, you don't work that hard. Wednesday you put in a good amount of effort, and then Thursday and Friday you have to ease out into the weekend. And I see some of
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, and I'm thinking like, what the hell's going on in the world? Like, if you were
Well, I
to,
can tell you part of what's going on in the world that accounts for it, right? And it scares me, frankly, a lot, as it sounds like it worries you, right? Look, the generations after my generation lived in a world where there was plenty. They were comfortable. They were almost uniformly told they were wonderful, that the sun rose and fell, behind them. They were encouraged to think very highly of themselves, right? Um, and, then you see these kinds of behaviors, right? In some, I don't think that I certainly know people in those generations that work super
yeah, of
hard
course,
and,
of course.
yeah, no, so we don't want to generalize too broadly, right? That's the negative part. The positive part is a lot of those same generations care a lot more about purpose and mission in their work than they did, right? People in my generation, they were just happy to have a really good job, right? And in my
Yeah.
father's generation, post Second World War, they were just happy to have peace, and a good job, right? So there's been an evolution, I think, in the direction of feeling like you need more purpose, feeling like you need more, X, Y, and Z, feeling like you're entitled to advancement very rapidly, feeling like, you should be served almost, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that's a product of an environment of plenty, right? We're not living in an environment of plenty anymore.
Yeah.
And I believe we're going to live in an increasingly challenging environment,
Yeah.
potentially very challenging environment. And I don't know what's going to happen to these folks when, you know, they transition from, scary Sundays and
They're gonna
lazy work
get
to finding they can't
they're
feed
gonna get their
themselves, they
asses
can't feed
kicked
their
is what's gonna
families.
happen.
That's my
And
worry. My worry
y-
is that, yeah,
yeah, and I think we need to get back to some of that old school work ethic. And I mean, to your point of purpose and meaning and impact, I'm a big believer in that stuff too. But why is the assumption on behalf of employees that it's really just up to the organization and up to the leader to create all of that for you? I feel like in a lot of businesses today, employees are showing up, they're pointing out all the problems in the company and they're saying, hey, where's my purpose? Where's my impact? Where's my meaning? As if it's supposed to be handed to you. But It's
Yep.
no more the responsibility of the leader to create your purpose and meaning than it is your responsibility to help identify what your purpose and meaning is. And if you just show up to a company
Mm,
pointing out problems and expecting things to be done for you, not willing to occasionally make that sacrifice, to do what you need to do, to work hard, to show up with your best
yeah.
ideas, then yeah, like purpose isn't something that's handed to you. You have to help create it as well. And a part of it is not just what happens at work, but it's also
Yeah.
what you do outside of work, right? Do you have
Of
community?
course.
Do you have social involvement? Do you have friends who challenge you and push you? And I think all of those are necessary elements that have to come together to help create that purpose and meaning. And it's hard,
Can
right?
I
Because
push back on you a little bit, Jacob?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I agree in part with what you're saying, but I also, I think, take issue a bit with other elements of it. You know, back to Viktor Frankl, right? Holocaust survivor,
yeah,
writer of Man's Quest for Meaning, right? I think we do have some inherent desire to have what we do mean something, right?
yes,
Unless you're kind of just like, okay, here's life, we're going to get through it and we die. It's just the great conveyor belt, as I had a colleague once describe it to me, and you fall off the end. There is, I think, a desire among not all, but many people to have a sense that this all means something, right?
yeah. I have that desire as
And
well.
yeah, and you do it, right? I mean, you're touching a ton of people out there with your ideas and the people you bring. And so, you're creating meaning in what you do, right? But it also intersects with the land of plenty kind of discussion we were having, right? Which is, you can't expect to have like big meaning in everything that you do for everybody. It's not, you're not going to save the world. I'm not going to save the world.
Yeah.
Together, we might do some stuff, right? So I wouldn't sort of set aside purpose and meaning completely. Um, I also would say, the labor market is changing a great deal, right? And so when there were shortages in the labor market, employers had to woo, right, the younger workers with the promise of purpose. Yeah, that again, I think will switch off in a microsecond.
Yeah.
If the tables turn in terms of the labor market, and that's unfortunate, but I think it's probably the reality of what's going on out there. I mean,
Yep.
I'm very interested and engaged with AI these days, and I'm more on the pessimistic side, I guess, than the optimistic side. And I think it's gonna we're and by the way, not because I think AI is gonna like destroy the world or eliminate mankind. I think it's gonna change the foundations of economies in ways that are gonna make it much harder to thrive in the future.
The topic of vulnerability is front and center inside of a lot of organizations today. But should you actually be vulnerable at work? In my brand new book, Leading with Vulnerability, I actually say that you should not be vulnerable at work, but instead you should lead with vulnerability. The difference? Vulnerability is about exposing a gap, whereas leading with vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have and then demonstrating what you are trying to do to close that gap. To figure out how to make all of this happen, I interviewed over 100 CEOs and surveyed 14,000 employees around the world, and I put all of that into my brand new book, which just came out. You can learn more by heading over to leadwithvulnerability.com. Again, that is leadwithvulnerability.com. Purpose and meaning, I agree, is totally important. And I think there are things that organizations, that leaders can do as far as telling stories to employees, helping them understand how the work that they're doing is touching the customer or the company or the business. But there are also things that employees need to do themselves. And so I think it's kind of a two-part, right? I mean, there are things that leaders can do, there are things that employees can do. But to me, it seems like a lot of the reliance is on behalf of the leaders and organizations, and employees
So
are
that's
not wanting
interesting.
to take much accountability to say that, yeah, some of it does rely on me, right? Some of it does rely on me to show up to work with an open mind, with a sense of curiosity, with the willingness to work hard, with the willingness to challenge myself and get out of my comfort zone. And leaders in turn need to show up and say, you know what, we're going to help you understand how the work that you're doing is touching customers or employees. We're going to help you connect with those customers yourself so you can hear those stories. We're going to teach you that if you're in sales and you bring extra money into the business, where that money is going and how it's impacting something. So there are kind of both parts that can come together to help create that. But a lot of employees need to understand that they have some accountability in their own purpose and meaning and their experience at work as well. And I just think that that is a message that needs to be communicated more often inside of organizations.
Yeah.
And it almost
I
feels
think
like
it's also highly dependent, Jacob, on the kind of organization you're working for too, right?
Yes.
I one of the CEOs I work with, leads a large healthcare organization in the US, right? And it's much easier to connect people to a sense of purpose when you're actually serving patients, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're, operating a coal mine, it's probably a little harder to
Yes.
connect people to any kind of sense of purpose here. I
Yeah.
also think, you don't want to condemn generations as lazy and shiftless, right? I
Totally agree.
do have some hope that, if things do get much more challenging, there will be people who will step up to it.
Yeah.
It
And I
gets
think
us, by
it's,
the way, you said something earlier that I'm endlessly fascinated by, which is, do the times call forth the leaders? It's a really interesting, because it seems to sometimes when you look at history and you see in moments of crisis, right, in moments of difficulty, certain kinds of leaders emerge, right?
yeah.
And that actually gives me a bit of hope, right, that we may see something similar.
Yeah. And I do think, of course, the type of business that you're in makes a difference. I mean, I used to work at a movie theater having to upsell people in a concession stand, and they used to have contests.
Ouch.
I had no idea where that money was going or why I was even upselling people. But then I was told another story about the San Diego Zoo where they had the exact same competition, where employees behind the concession stand were supposed to upsell customers. But the difference is in that story, when they upsold customers and brought in more money, the leaders then said, hey, here's how the extra money that you're bringing in is helping fight conservation efforts. Like, here's how we're going to fight extinction
Yeah.
for this particular animal based on how you're upselling and bringing in more money through the concession stand. So I think there are lots of really interesting and creative ways that we can explore to how to help create that. But employees need to play a role and leaders need to play a
Yeah, no,
role.
I get it.
And it's to your point,
I
it's not,
agree that there's got to be a reciprocal kind of arrangement.
yeah.
I won't argue with that.
Yeah, and to your point, I don't think it's generation specific at all. I think it's more mindset specific. And one of the things that I tell people is there's a very good opportunity for anybody right now who's willing to work hard and push themselves out of their comfort zone and challenge themselves. You don't have any employees who want to show up to the office, you show up to the office and see what's going to happen to your career. You have employees who only want to work 28 or 30 hours a week, you work 34 hours a week or 40 hours a week and see what's going to happen to your career. So we're kind of at this, I think, an interesting time where those who are willing to make those sacrifices and to work hard and to push themselves are going to, I think, reap the rewards, to your point, as we kind of get through this pretty
So
crazy,
where do you
chaotic
come
time.
out on income inequality in the U.S.? I mean, where does that sit in this picture for you?
Well,
Because
so
I mean,
like what,
if you look at the data today, we've never seen higher levels of income inequality in the U.S. since the verge of the Great Depression, right?
yeah,
And I just wonder, because I love what you're saying, Jacob, right? And I really believe that entrepreneurship and initiative and being proactive matters greatly. And getting out there and grabbing for something and pushing for something is super important. But I also wonder, if you're living, out in those sorts of places, you know, are do you really have that level of opportunity or not, right?
you
When
do.
you're holding down a couple jobs, or so you do think you do.
Yeah, I mean, my dad is an example of that. He was an immigrant from the former USSR. He came
Mhm.
to America chasing the American dream. They migrated from the Republic of Georgia to Italy to Australia, which is where I was born, to the United States.
Mm.
They came here, no money, didn't speak the language, had no possessions. My dad lived in low income housing in the projects in New Jersey. And he had a choice. He could either live with other Russian and Georgian speakers, or he could live with people who didn't speak Russian and Georgian, but lived in low income with American speakers. He chose to
Mm.
live outside of his comfort zone, not in his community, but with low income American speakers. And he learned how to speak English by watching the Johnny Carson show with an English to Russian translation dictionary. And he came, they literally came from nothing. So I'm a big believer in the American dream. I think a lot of it is, I don't want to say completely going to hell, but there are a lot of challenges right now as far as what's going
But
on in the US
yeah,
with
I
that.
guess that's what I would want to explore with you, right? Which is, first of all, that's fantastic, right? And I think it's one of the incredibly inspiring stories that one hears about, people that came with virtually nothing to the U.S. and made good lives for
Yeah, and there are
themselves,
lots
right?
of those types of
I,
stories.
yeah, but do you think they happen today in the same way? Do you think, because it just feels like things are different, right?
It does feel like things are different. It does. Yeah, I don't know. I forgot which podcast I was listening to. This was a while ago, but they were talking about, maybe it was, actually, I don't want to say because I don't even remember, but they were talking about we need to redefine what it means to be a hero. And
Mm.
I think
Oh,
a
that's
big part of
interesting.
the challenge is that we used to hear a lot of those types of hero stories back in the day, right? 70s, 80s, maybe even through the 90s. And then as we got to the era of social media, 2000s and beyond, you don't hear those types of hero stories anymore. Our heroes today are different, right? We don't hear those stories about people who've come to America or who've come to any country who've built businesses from the ground up, who are learning, who are able to take care of their families after they came from nothing. Like those to me are the hero stories. And we don't talk about them. We don't hear about them. They're not in mainstream
That's
media.
true.
We don't, right? So our
It's true.
idea, I think,
100%
not
true.
just,
What we hear is the breakthrough of the TikTok influencer, right?
yeah,
That's the heroism of today. Yeah.
exactly. So our definition of a hero has completely changed. And I'm a big believer in what you incentivize grows. My wife always reminds me of this too when I'm thinking about different aspects of my business. And she's like, well, what you focus on grows. And if we're going to focus on TikTok influencers, if we're going to focus on lazy girl jobs, if we're going to focus on don't work hard and try to take advantage in areas where you can, if you're a victim, if you can identify the problems in your company and don't come up with your own solutions, then that's what we're going to create. That's what we're going to incentivize. That's going to be the new hero. And it's not to say that there aren't problems. Like I get there's lots of challenges, there's lots of issues, nothing is perfect. But I think there are a lot of, that's just one of the challenges that I think we're seeing
Mm,
is just redefining who the hero is. And when I hear
that's
stories,
interesting.
from friends or family members that have came here from nothing, I'm like, that should be the front page of the New York Times. Like that should be the story that we're talking about and hearing that you can do these things. So I just wish we spent more time focusing on those. But do I have a
Yeah.
solution
I
to
mean,
everything?
no, I know you don't, and I know that's not what you're saying, right, at all. I think where I agree with you is that I feel like we're in a time of kind of cultural malaise, right? And I
Yes,
think that, and there's many reasons why we're in a time of cultural malaise, I think social media has played a huge role in that. We're in a time of division, right? We're in a time of separation, not
hugely.
coming together to do things. I mean, most good hero stories involve the coming together of people to accomplish something,
Yeah.
to go through the valley together, right? We don't see much of
No.
encouragement for that kind of collective action today. There are still people that are trying to do good things for sure, right? But I think
Yeah.
yeah. And I think just, I now live in Switzerland which is where I am now. And, but I look at what's happening in the US and it's just so incredibly upsetting
Oh, it's crazy.
because the U.S. should be the country you described your father came to, right?
Yeah,
That
it's not.
bastion of democracy and free enterprise and hope, and you see it just being torn down, right, to a
It
degree, and
is,
it's super unfortunate.
and
Anyway,
it's
we got a
sad.
little distance off of strategic thinking, but
Yeah, yeah. We're gonna get to those
that's a
six
good
disciplines, and
conversation.
I'll end on one thing that for me the sad thing is like every Fourth of July, my dad is very proud to hang up that American flag in his front yard, and he's not even from here, and he's one of the most proudest non-American Americans I know. And I could always tell he gets very emotional. He gets a little
Mm.
teary-eyed when he's putting up that American flag because he came from communism, where everything was taken from him, where he had nothing, where he was persecuted for being a Jew, and he comes here and he's able to build a life for himself. And I know that every Fourth of July, he is just so eternally grateful for what this country has been able to do for him and how hard he's been able to work. And I just wish more people would talk about those types of
Yeah.
stories.
Well, and there's something so important, Jacob, in what you're saying too, right? Because I look at the people who, are complaining about, X, Y, Z about the way the US runs or something like that. And, I still have enough connectivity to my father's generation. He's passed away, but, the Great Depression, the Second World War, these enormous challenges. And I sometimes think people have absolutely no idea how bad things could get,
Yeah.
right? They have no conception, right? Whereas your father had a conception. He knew how bad things could be, right? And so he's
Yep.
got gratitude for what is, right? And I just
Yeah.
wish that we could have more perspective about the fact that, yeah, it's not perfect, but in historical and other terms, it's pretty darn good,
It is.
and
Yes.
if we keep
Yes.
going down the road of tearing it down, we're going to end up in a place where,
Yes.
it's really pretty awful, I think,
More
unfortunately.
positivity. Yes. All right. So
Exactly.
now that we digress a little bit, let's get back to your six principles.
Sure.
So why
Sure.
don't we start with principle number one, which we alluded to a little bit earlier when we were talking about chess, which is pattern recognition.
Yep.
So, A, why is that important? And how do you, obviously, it's one thing to recognize patterns in a chessboard where you see the pieces moving the certain way. How do you actually do pattern recognition when it comes to business?
Yeah. Yeah. So if it's okay, I'm going to wind back really slightly before I answer the question, right? Because, when I started thinking about what is strategic thinking and, doing the interviews and discussions and so on, what I decided it sort of came down to is the ability of a leader to recognize emerging challenges and opportunities, prioritize the right things, and mobilize their organizations to do something about it, right? And so I anchored strategic thinking in that recognize, mobilize, prioritize kind of structure, right? And that's the overarching structure of the book. And then I said, okay, well, so what is it that lets leaders recognize emerging challenges and opportunities, right? And that really is very much the combination, I think, of that pattern recognition ability. So seeing what's important in noisy environments, in uncertain environments, in the midst of complexity, and that mental modeling systems capability that then lets you kind of make sense out of and do some projection about what this is going to mean, right? And so if you marry pattern recognition and systems thinking, I think you've got the foundations of the recognition part of the puzzle, as it were, right? And pattern recognition, it was so fun that you brought up chess because that was kind of a bit of a, you know, uh, it's an example I use and it's a good one, right? you know, how did you learn to see patterns in chess? You played a lot of chess games.
Yep.
You read about chess. You learned from the grandmasters of chess, right? You studied famous games, that were played and brilliant moves that were made. And chess.com has a daily puzzle every day, right? And I do it every single day, right? It's one of the problem solving things I do just in the morning, just to kind of warm my brain up, right?
Yeah,
And they're all
I
drawn
do, I
from
do them literally like, even if I have a couple minutes in between a podcast, I pull out the phone, I go on the chess app. And I don't know about you, but to me, it helps. It's like a form of meditation for me where I just kind of sit. There are
That's
very
cool.
few things that I can do for hours and hours and hours at a time. But playing chess and doing chess puzzles is one of those few things that if I'm doing it, I could do it all day.
Yeah. And because I started really late with this, I'm going through a little bit of a kind of pattern recognition development exercise. Like for you, this is refinement largely, right? At the stage you're at, I think probably. But for me, I'm starting to see patterns in what's going on. I look at a chessboard now and I see something different than I did when I picked that chess up app up for the first time, right? And I start solving puzzles and so on. And I think, so then you dissect, well, how did you get good at pattern recognition with chess? Well, you immersed yourself in the game, right? You played a lot of games. You found examples. You found, kind of a form of mentor in a master, and you apprentice to them, right? It's exactly the same thing in business, Jacob, right? To become effective at strategic thinking, you need to immerse yourself in a domain and focus on understanding the foundations of that domain and building up a notion of what patterns exist or tend to exist there so that you know that, hey, this is really not relevant. It's not going to take us anywhere. It doesn't matter. And this is, wow, we better pay attention to that because if we don't, checkmate is coming
Yeah.
within a few moves, right? So it really is a similar process. And I think immersion is part of it. I think working for people who are strong strategic thinkers and understanding how they see the world, right? What they look for, what they pay attention to, that can be a pretty big part of it. Um, yeah, so so to me, they're very, very similar kinds of processes, and that's why it's such a great metaphor, I think,
Yeah.
for strategic
Um,
thinking. Yeah.
okay, let's go to discipline number two, systems perspective, which we alluded to earlier, right?
Yeah.
Why is that an important discipline? And what is that discipline?
Be- Sure. So systems thinking lets you deal with complexity, right? The world is a very, very complicated place. And if you're trying to pay attention to every single variable in the environment you're operating in, you're going to get completely overloaded and overwhelmed, right?
Not possible, yeah.
And so somewhere, yeah, no, and at some point in our evolutionary history, we began to have the ability to build, what is commonly called mental models, but I think they're basically systems models. You mentioned causality earlier, right? Cause and effect, action and reaction. If I do this, that's going to happen, right? If I poke the bear, I'm going to get eaten. And those are early forms of systems thinking, right? And then you begin to overlay on that things like tipping points in systems or feedback loops in systems, right? If I get this going fast enough, it becomes self-sustaining, and oh my God, it's going to go out of control. There's fundamental ideas about systems that I think are hugely valuable, right? I'd go back to Peter Senge if that name means anything to you,
Yeah, yeah.
in the fifth discipline, right? And systems dynamics kinds of thinking. It's very, very analogous, right? But at its core, it lets us create simplified representations of complicated phenomenon that let us make predictions and take actions that have a reasonable shot of ending up doing what we think they should do, right? That to me is the core of it in systems thinking. And then the third one is we've already actually talked a fair amount about it. I actually jammed through two things together in the chapter on mental agility, and one is the chess master look forward a few moves, action reaction. From game theory, the idea of the best response, right?
Yeah.
You look at all the possible moves the opponent can make, and you think about the counter moves, and so then you think about, okay, well, given that they're likely to do these things, what's the best response I have? Or what's known as backward induction, right? Of kind of looking forward, reasoning backward to the sequence, the path that's going to take you there. So there's pretty basic ideas that flow. And also, but I combined that particular chapter with that level shifting cloud to ground, kind of ability to move between those layers, the powers of 10 that you mentioned earlier. And again, to me, that's a form of mental agility, right? It's a mental flexibility and agility to think through potential possibilities or move between levels of analysis. And that's again, I think, a big part of both recognizing and prioritizing what's critical, you know. And then there's some stuff in the back end of the book, I think might be surprising for some folks, that I don't think would necessarily commonly be associated with strategic thinking, right? And they're really more about the mobilization piece, right? So recognizing, prioritizing, mobilizing. You've got to mobilize your people and your organizations, right, to pursue these opportunities or avoid these particular challenges. And so, how are you going to do that? Um, and the three chapters: structured problem solving. So, how do you take a team through a process of problem framing and solving that leads to the best possible outcome, but also moves the team collectively in the direction they want to go?
Hmm.
Visioning, which I know you've done some studying on, that sort of is sometimes called backcasting, right? Of
Yep.
imagining a desirable future and working your way back into how we're going to start the path of getting there. Yeah. And then I think probably the one that is going to be most strange for people is the last chapter, which is political savvy, right?
Yeah.
How do you navigate complex political environments in ways that let you move energy forward? I mean, that's, I guess, the way I think about it very much in energetic terms, right? That you're trying to mobilize organizational energy, build alliances, get access to resources. One of the CEO that's mentioned in the introduction, he's just absolutely masterful at doing deals. You mentioned negotiation earlier that no one thought was possible to be done, right? Because he's got this incredible sophistication in thinking about stakeholders and thinking about political agendas and thinking about how do we craft a deal that's acceptable? What's the right sequence to do things? So to me, that's kind of that, a core, those three things: the structured problem solving of moving your team forward, the visioning to mobilize the energy of your people, right? The political savvy to navigate, get access to resources, navigate the deals that you need to do. Those three things are the mobilization part of strategic thinking in the way I sort of conceptualize it.
Okay. So then let's spend the rest of our time talking about how to actually develop your strategic thinking ability. So we went over those 6 disciplines. So people who are listening and watching this might be thinking, okay, I got what those 6 disciplines are. They all make sense. Now what? How do I actually put those things into practice? All right, my conversation with Michael Watkins continues as we talk about how to actually develop your strategic thinking ability. And Michael's going to share some exercises that he does on a regular basis and how they help him develop strategic thinking abilities, not just for him, but for a lot of the CEOs and people that he works with as well. This Leaders Toolkit episode is only available for subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. You can do that simply by opening the Apple Podcasts app on your phone or on your desktop. Hit subscribe. There's a trial option in there as well, and I hope you decide to take advantage of that. 2 other things that I'll mention. My book, Leading with Vulnerability, is available. You can grab a copy at leadwithvulnerability.com. And last but not least, join our community on Substack, greatleadership.substack.com. If you want to get a 20% discount, you go to greatleadership.substack.com/GL podcast. greatleadership.substack.com/GL podcast. If that's too confusing and you forget it, just email me and I'll hook you up, jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Tell me that you saw this on a podcast episode, you want your 20% discount, and I will send you the link directly. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I will see you next time.